Good to see you all again. On Tuesday, I talked about just briefly what is patentable, taking your concept for your invention or this concept that you want to build this company around and condensing it to 150 to 250 words. Ask yourself, does this thing look like it's patentable? Does it look like this combination of elements has ever been done before? And ask yourself, if I got a patent on these 150 to 250 words, would this be useful to me and to my company? And that 150 to 250 words is a fairly good indicator of whether or not this thing is both patentable and useful to your company, short-term and long-term. Another good way to vet a concept, vet the patentability of your invention, is to put yourself in the shoes of the CEO of your company, the chief executive officer, the guy who's getting up and pitching this technology to an angel investor or to a VC. So if you are the chief executive officer of your company, what are you telling that investor in that 30-second elevator pitch or that 5 minutes you have at a demo day? And then put yourself in the shoes of the CTO, the chief technology officer, and ask what brings her to work every day and gets her excited about her job. What is it that she has never seen before and is working so hard to achieve? And then figure out what the overlap is between the CTO and the CEO. And that could be a core technology that's incredibly valuable to your company, incredibly valuable to get some intellectual property rights on that concept. And finally, another really good way to ask or to answer the question, what should I patent, is what's really hard? What was that, this thing that you've been working on for months and months and months, could make no leaps forward on, but all of a sudden one day you figured it out, and all of a sudden you're on a different level. That big hurdle, that breakthrough, you have to imagine that if there'll be a competitor in your market down the road, that competitor will have to make that same breakthrough. And figuring out that breakthrough, if you can get a patent on that, could put you ahead of your competitors for many, many years, make you a leader in that space. So about a month ago, the United States switched from a first to invent system to a first to file system. We're now in line, for the most part, with the rest of the world. There's one very key difference I'll get to here shortly, but generally speaking, the United States, Finland, China, Japan, Australia, we're all first to file now. Under first to file, before you disclose your invention, you have to make a claim to patent that concept, to patent that invention. And what I mean by that is, if you tell the world about your invention, you make it public, you've effectively given up your rights to that invention if you haven't told a patent office, hey, I want to claim this in a future patent application. Imagine this. It's a sort of silly example, but say you're an entrepreneur, you love open source technology, and you actually hate patents for some reason. And so you develop this very cool technology, and you write a couple blog posts, you give a couple presentations about your technology, but you never file a patent application on that technology with a patent office. You've effectively gifted this technology to the world. But say that some competitor of yours realizes that there's a lot of money in this technology, and he decides that he's going to file this patent application on this thing that you disclosed. And he gets a patent on it. And now he can, even though you came up with this invention, that competitor of yours can actually exclude you from making and using that invention. It seems kind of unfair. Yeah? Well, just about every patent office in the world thinks that's unfair too. And so once this invention is disclosed, it can no longer be patented. So one way to get around that is to file a provisional application prior to disclosing, or filing a full application prior to disclosing, filing a PCT application prior to disclosing. So in this case, you can file a provisional application right before demo day, disclose, and then 12 months later, hone in on what is really patentable or what you really need to protect, and file a full patent application in the United States or in Finland or in England, and then file a PCT along with it if foreign rights are important to you. So by filing some sort of application prior to disclosure, you can maintain your right to foreign rights, foreign patent protection. But let's say that you disclose, and then you realize, oh, wow, this is really important, I should patent this. Or you disclose, and then later on, you talk to an angel investor, and the angel investor says, I'm not going to invest in you unless you get a patent on this. Well, unfortunately, you've already disclosed your invention. You've given up your patent rights. And so you've lost the ability to patent this invention anywhere in the world except, oddly enough, the United States. And you occasionally hear this term, grace period. And in the United States, and in the United States alone, you can disclose, then file an application afterwards, as long as you file that application within a year of disclosing. And so by disclosing in the United States, you haven't actually waived your patent rights unless you fail to file a patent application on that invention within a year of disclosure. So in fact, in the United States, you can disclose on, you can disclose, and then a year later file a provisional application, and even a year later after that, file a full application. This is not particularly recommended, especially now that we're under Firsttofile. But if the United States is your only market, which is fairly uncommon these days, but if the United States is your only market, this is one potential route to take if you need to disclose, you don't have the funds to pay for the applications up front. Again, it's not recommended. But what is disclosure? It's actually a pretty difficult thing to answer. And the Patent Office recognizes this. It's very hard to say, yes, this is definitely disclosure, or no, this definitely isn't. There are some gray areas. So we'll get into those. So publications. If you're building some product, whether it's an app or a physical piece of hardware, and a journalist at some tech company hears about you and says, you're doing really cool things, I want to come interview you, take some pictures of your product, and write an article about you. The journalist comes to your workspace, interviews you, takes some pictures, goes back the next day to her office, writes an awesome review about what you're doing, says you're going to change the world, and publishes it that day. As soon as that article is published, whether it's on the internet or in print, that's disclosure. You've told the world about your invention. It doesn't matter if it's a tiny little paper that's published in Papua New Guinea and it's not actually read by anybody except for 100 locals, and you're trying to get patent protection in the United States or in Finland, it still counts as disclosure. It's published somewhere in the world. And so prior to inviting that journalist over, file a provisional application so you can retain those patent rights. How about if you're in beta testing? You made a couple prototypes, some physical prototypes, or you have a beta app that you've given the password to for 50 of your best friends. And they're testing this product. They're giving you feedback on the product itself, and you're using that feedback to improve the product. That's actually probably not public disclosure. There's this keen sense of awareness that this is a private community testing the product to improve it. And the United States actually doesn't recognize that as disclosure. But let's say that what you're actually testing is marketing material for that invention, or you're testing packaging for that material, or you're switching the color of the product from red to green to blue to figure out which one is more marketable to potential customers. You're not actually improving the product. You are improving the marketability of the product, and that does qualify as disclosure. So as long as you're in beta and you're using this feedback to improve the product, that's actually not disclosure. I have a client who's making it's actually really cool. It's an automatic burger making machine. You feed in patties and buns, and it toasts the buns, it grills the patty, and then it slices fresh tomatoes and sets them on top of the patty, and then it actually wraps it in paper and spits it out. It's really super cool. It can make one hamburger every 10 seconds. They're really good burgers too. And they were talking about strapping this thing down to the back of a pickup truck and driving it around San Francisco and making hamburgers and giving it out for free as a sort of publicity marketing stunt. They could wrap that machine in a big white tarp so no one could actually see the machine, and all they got was this tiny little view of the trapdoor that spits the burgers out. And once they hand out that first burger, it's actually public disclosure. It doesn't matter if anyone can see the machine and how it works on the inside. The fact that someone is using a product of this invention, and specifically in this case, eating a product of the invention, that's actually public disclosure. So prior to a marketing stunt, file provisional on your technology. Now what if it's a private investor meeting? You're sitting down with a group of potential investors. You're pitching your product, you're pitching your company. And there's this expectation that those investors aren't actually going to go out and tell a bunch of people about what you're doing. It's probably not public disclosure. Think about it this way. Those investors are there to invest in your company. So they think your company will be the leader in the market. And they see this potential for a return on that $50,000 or that $1 million investment. They're probably not going to go out and tell people about your invention because that hurts that investment. Because when they tell the people about your product, maybe they've disclosed this thing and you can no longer get patent rights. Or a competitor is going to pick up that information and implement it in their own technology. So there's this either implicit and or explicit assumption that, or expectation that those investors won't actually tell people about your invention. And so this most likely does not qualify as public disclosure.
So you don't have to have them sign an NDA or anything?
In the Bay Area, NDAs are very uncommon for investors and VCs. If you walk into a meeting and say, hey VC, sign this NDA, they're going to tell you to get out because they have plenty of, it's almost an insult. That you'd like to build this trust from the beginning and understand what your roles are as entrepreneur and investor. And it happens that investors, some very large VCs will disclose what was talked about in that meeting, but it's very, very rare, and those investors who do that, they're not really investors anymore. They break that trust. And there are so many investors in the Bay Area that those startups will go elsewhere so that they don't have to deal with that sort of nonsense. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
So how about a demo day? So a lot of demo days, at least in the Bay Area, they're open to the public, or they're open to friends and family and whoever else may be interested. Effectively, people can walk in off the street and watch a demo day. They also invite journalists. So they have TechCrunch and VentureBeat journalists come to these demo days. And they're there on the spot, tweeting and blogging about the products and pitches and companies. And there is this expectation that what you say will become public knowledge. And so that's almost definitely public disclosure. And last but not least, if you actually launch your product, you put an app on the App Store, or you put some product on the shelf and start selling it, that's public disclosure. That's on sale and in public use. And that's disclosure. So if you have any concern that what you're about to do will qualify as public disclosure and you want patent rights, you'd like to pursue patent rights on this technology that you're working on, file a provisional application. We talked about provisionals on Thursday. We can talk about, or Tuesday, we can talk about them more if you have more questions about them when I'm done. But if there's any concern that what you're about to do could be construed as disclosure, file that provisional application beforehand. And then later on, if a year from now you decide that invention, which you captured in that provisional, is still relevant, you file the full application and or a PCT application that claims priority to that to the provisional. And so you can get behind that disclosure date. So you can maintain that right to patent that technology. So we've answered the questions about disclosure, what's potentially patentable, what to patent. How do you actually do this? How do you build a portfolio? The answer is not to dump a whole bunch of money into IP. You don't spend your $50,000 friends and family round or seed round, all on IP. Your portfolio needs to scale with your company. When I say scale with your company, I mean scale with the valuation of your company, scale with the amount of money you've raised, scale with the development of your product. You can imagine the scenario in which you just raised $50,000 and you think you have so many ideas, you want to patent all of them right up front. And so you pay a lawyer, such as my firm, we actually never do this, but you pay a firm to file 10 provisional applications at $5,000 a piece, capturing all the things that you want to do with your company and where you think the technology is going to go. So you spend every penny of that $50,000 up front on IP. And then a year later, within the next year, you need to raise $150,000 just for IP expenses. It's between $15,000 and $16,000 to have a full application with claims filed, and that's just in the United States. And if you just file 15 provisionals and you want to convert them all into non-provisional patent applications, that's 10 times $15,000. But the issue is that you just spent all of your money on filing those provisional applications, and you can't actually develop something. You can't develop a product in order to attract more investors to get that $150,000. So say for some miracle occurs and you're actually able to raise another $50,000 from the same people who invested in you in the first place. A year later, the best you can do is file 3 patent applications. It's $15,000 a piece, and you have $50,000. So spend $45,000 on converting these provisionals to, or 3 of these provisionals to full applications. And you abandon 7 other provisional applications. That's $35,000 you wasted from the previous year from that first investment round. And it's a pretty hard path to take. In that case, the biggest issue is that the technology hadn't been developed, and all that money was instead spent on IP up front. That's worst case scenario, but it is somewhat telling. So instead, let's go through an example of a company that's spending money on IP wisely. Its IP budget is growing with the company. I had this client called Pantry Labs. They were just accepted into an incubator down the street from our office called Lemnos Labs. Lemnos gives, I think it's on the order of $150,000 to the companies that it takes on in exchange for a certain percentage of equity. Now, Pantry is making a vending machine, kind of reinventing the vending machine. Instead of walking up and putting a $1 bill or swiping your credit card and getting just one product out of the machine, instead it's a refrigerator with a big glass door on it, and a user can walk up, swipe his card, open the door, and pull out fresh produce from local cafes, local restaurants, local bakeries. Those local vendors will every day or several times a day will stock those machines with fresh salads and fresh sandwiches and fresh soups and fresh squeezed orange juice. So this consumer can come up and pull out as much as he wants. And when he closes the door, the machine reads all these RFID tags that are applied to the remaining product in that machine. It determines what's been removed, and based on that, bills the customer for all the products he's taken. So you can imagine there are quite a few different, just general technologies going on here. First is they're building hardware. Pantry actually has to make a physical vending machine. On top of that, there's probably software that's running on that vending machine. They have to be able to maintain an inventory. They have to be able to maintain or maybe adjust pricing depending on time of day or demand. They have to be able to communicate with those vendors to say, hey, we're out of salads, or hey, we're out of orange juice, bring more. There could be a social component to this. There's also probably a business method. In the United States, at least, business methods are patentable. So how are you interfacing with all those vendors? What is this flow of money and food between the consumer, the machine, and vendors? They don't know these things yet. This is down the road. Maybe there's a big data play here. So you actually know when your customers are buying food, what they're buying, how much they're spending, and there are all sorts of different ways you can use that data to improve that buying experience, get consumers to buy more, to buy healthier products. So we have potentially hardware, software, social, big data, and business method. But what is Pantry actually working on right now? Hardware and software. They're building a machine and they're building the software to run that machine. And that's probably all they're going to do for the next year. At that point, a year from now, they'll actually install those machines around San Francisco, maybe at a couple bakeries, coffee shops, maybe actually in a couple other incubators or in some other office spaces. And they'll figure out what that business method how to actually implement this business method and what it needs to look like in order to get vendors locally to put product in the machine. And that won't start maybe for a year from now. And then they'll actually have consumers buying stuff out of these machines. They'll figure out, do consumers actually care about social? And so the social component, the big data component, may be 2 years off. But it's certainly not something they know enough about right now to file patent applications on it. So instead, if Pantry were to build a patent portfolio right now, it might look like this. They filed 2 provisionals this year on hardware and 1 on software. And so they raised $150,000, and they'll spend $10,000 on it on 2 provisional applications. Is that 6%, 7% of their current funding round they'll spend on IP? Now next year they'll have to convert those provisional applications to full applications. Those are $15,000 a piece. Like I said, maybe they'll know more about the business method, and they'll file provisional on that. And one thing to know here that's really important is that they got a year between filing the provisional application and filing the full application to learn about the hardware and the software. They're going to learn additional content, learn additional data, figure things out, exactly what the dimensions need to be, how the RFID reader is actually going to scan all this product on these shelves. They'll figure that out, and they can use all of that information to augment these non-provisional applications. They add this content to the provisional file, then the non-provisional application. There can be some very subtle sort of secret sauce things added, learned over that year, and then added to those non-provisional applications. And those could be the difference between a patent and an abandoned patent application. It could be the difference between a broad patent application or a broad patent that claims a lot and is incredibly useful to Pantry, and a very narrow, very focused issued patent that may not actually be all that relevant in 2 years. And in the 3rd year, if things progress relatively quickly at the patent office, an examiner at the patent office may issue an office action. We talked briefly about office actions on Tuesday, but office actions are effectively just letters that an examiner at the patent office sends you or your attorney saying, I don't think this thing is patentable. And our office charges about $5,000 to respond to each of those office actions. We amend the claims, we call examiners and discuss the invention, and we make arguments about how we think the examiner's his logic is faulty in rejecting these claims. So each of those is $5,000, and it might be that in the 3rd year we get office office actions on these applications. Right, and then we have to file a non-provisional application claiming priority to that 3rd provisional on the business method. Maybe at this time we're ready to file those provisionals on social and those provisionals on big data. And maybe at this time, Pantry is getting contracts. They're getting deals. People actually want to buy these things and put them in their businesses. And we would need to make sure that Pantry doesn't infringe on someone else's patent. So we do what's called a freedom to operate search, or a preliminary freedom to operate search, where we look at all of Pantry's main competitors. We determine if they infringe any of those patents assigned to those competitors. And so in that 3rd year, maybe now it's $40,000. So we went from 10 in the 1st year, 30 in the 2nd year, to 40 in the 3rd year. This number could actually be significantly bigger. Maybe Pantry is figuring out that there are a whole bunch of other fields that are relevant here, other technologies that they'll need in order to differentiate themselves from competitors, and those are things that we don't even know about yet. But maybe this is not 40,000, maybe it's actually 60,000. The portfolio is scaling, it's getting bigger, we're filing more applications every year. So that again could be 60,000 in that third year. But by that point, they probably raised $1 million. Maybe they're in their Series A and they're trying to raise $4 million. Maybe they've engaged a much larger company, a food vending company, and that company is paying Pantry gobs and gobs of money to test with them, to develop technologies together. We can't actually see that far out, but we know that in that third year, they'll be spending at least $40,000 on IP.
What does FTO stand for?
Oh, freedom to operate. The P in front means preliminary freedom to operate. In order to do an official freedom to operate in the United States, you have to be an attorney. And in our office, we're patent agents. We're not attorneys in the state of California. And so we take freedom to operate a little bit differently. If we find issues, we will send them to attorneys. Our focus is on patent prosecution and not so much on litigation. So we've talked about upcoming disclosures. If you intend to disclose something, file a patent application before that. You can write a provisional application yourself, $125. You know, there are instances in which you know demo day is coming. You know it's 3 months away. You can plan for that $5,000 to pay your attorney. That attorney, you could tell your attorney, hey, we have a demo day in 3 months. Please put us down. We need to file provisional before that. Other times, that journalist calls you out of the blue and says, I'm coming over right now to interview you and take some pictures. And you have to get a provisional written that day and filed that day. Very few, if any, attorneys I know can move that quickly. And so that $125 and a couple hours of your time to write and file that provisional application is time and money well spent before that journalist publishes that article. Markets and foreign rights, again, if you disclose and you haven't filed a provisional application of any kind prior to disclosing, you've waived your foreign rights. So that comes into play here also. It's also something to consider regarding the cost of foreign rights. So just to back up, look at this. It's $5,000 for a provisional, $15,000 for a full application, an additional $5,000 for a PCT, which sounds expensive, you know, in this first year of pursuing patent protection. But if you intend to pursue patent rights in multiple foreign countries, this PCT lets you put off the cost of entering all those national stage applications for a whole 18 months. A lot can happen in 18 months. I had a client who raised $2.5 million in a seed round. One of them was he founded a very big tech company in a sense. It was a browser that I'm sure some of you use, but his company developed that, as well as a mailbox. That was his first company. It did really, really well. And a lot of investors said, hey, you did so well, take some money and just do something with it. And he raised $2.2 million or $2.5 million and was working on diabetes and health and wellness. And 13 months later, Jawbone acquired him. So 13 months, a lot can happen in 13 months. And that acquisition was tens of millions of dollars. And so you really don't know what's going to happen 18 months from now. You may have so much money that filing these national stage applications, $5,000 to $10,000 a piece in 5 other countries is just pocket change. But right now, that's a lot of money, and being able to postpone that cost by a year and a half can be incredibly important.
What's the main reason startups are pursuing foreign rights? Is it because they get more money from investors, or?
It's a great question. We're in a global economy effectively right now. The U.S. is oftentimes a huge market. But say you're a hardware company and your product will be made in China. China is notorious for knocking off American products, making copies of their own. And China is starting to realize that there are a lot of companies, big and small, who are weary about having their products made in China because they know the Chinese will just copy them. And they're taking patent law and patent infringement much more seriously in China than they used to. And pursuing patent protection in China, at least in the long term, could be very important to protecting your hardware and make sure that there aren't one or a dozen companies in China knocking off your product. That's just one example, but we have quite a few clients for whom protection in China, Japan, Australia, and Europe, in addition to the United States, is incredibly important. Just ask yourself, where's the market? Russia is also notorious for knocking off software. They have copies of Amazon and copies of Facebook that look practically identical to Facebook and to Amazon, because those countries, as far as I know, didn't pursue patent protection in those countries, or didn't pursue patent protection on technologies that really differentiated and made Facebook or Amazon important to the world. And so those are two examples of hardware and software, in which case patent rights would have been incredibly important to those.
So it's more about protecting your rights, not to get investment like the IP.
Yeah, it's we've found some investors who are very concerned about international protection, but that's typically a little bit down the road. So you've raised a significant Series A from a handful of VCs, and all of a sudden you have a board member or a couple board members because you raised money from 3 different VCs. At that point, they're typically concerned about international protection. Earlier on with angels, it's not always the case. There are always exceptions, of course, but I hear less from our clients that their angel investors are concerned about international protection. They're more concerned about domestic rights. But on the flip side, getting international protection on your core. You imagine if Facebook had protection on its first 7 patents in Russia, patenting the social network in Russia. Facebook would have, I don't know what the population of Russia is, but I think it's pretty big. They would have that many more clients or customers potentially, because Russia wouldn't have been able to copy Facebook. And so there is this balance. When we file PCTs, we often file PCTs on the core technology. We pursue patent protection in other countries on that core technology. And the core technology is usually the first 3, the first 5, the first 10 patent applications, depending on what the technology is and what the company is actually creating. Later on, when we're at patent application 20 or patent application 30, we're not filing as many, if any, PCTs at that point, generally speaking. We do have one company, our biggest client has about 100 employees, and it's entirely software. And we're still pursuing patent protection in Europe and in Australia and abroad, despite the fact that it is software and despite the fact that we're on patent application 40-something right now. So it really very much depends on the company and the technology, but getting international protection on those core technologies can be incredibly important. That answers your question?
Yeah.
So we also discussed finances, actually having money to afford patent protection right now, filing those provisional applications, and then filing the non-provisional applications a year later. And then the office actions a year or 2 after that, and eventually you'll have to pay issue fees. So being able to predict, well, you know how much things are going to cost, generally speaking. At least at our firm, we have flat rates on everything. Any piece of paper we send to the patent office, you know exactly how much it costs going in. But generally speaking, regardless of the firm, you can get a rough estimate of what each of these provisionals, non-provisional applications, PCTs, office actions, what all that will cost you. So you can predict, generally, down the road, at least a couple months, maybe a couple years. You know what the milestones are and how much they'll cost. Development, again, Pantry was a good example. They're developing their hardware and software components right now. They're not yet developing the social or the business method or the, whatever the other one was. They're not working on that right now. So though they know that they will eventually have to file a patent on those technologies, they're waiting. They're waiting until they know that, on that Gantt chart, on that schedule of what we're developing, they can at least see, okay, we're going to start working on big data. And when they can see that sometime in the near future, then they'll file the provisional application on that. They'll develop that technology for a year, and then augment and boost that provisional application with all that information they learned, and file that with the full application. Finally, past IP budgets. This is kind of hard to put a measure on this, but generally speaking, the amount of money that you're spending on IP is somewhat indicative of how much you're innovating, how your company is growing. And if you spend $5,000 this year, $10,000 next year, $40,000 the year after, and then $10,000 the next year, it can potentially be indicative to investors that you've hit a major roadblock, that you're not innovating, that you're not growing. And though this is not always the case, it can be useful to plan to scale your the amount of money you spend on IP every year. That amount of money grows every year. And of course, there are always exceptions to that. Oops. Last thing is upcoming and anticipated funding rounds. Again, our firm charges $5,000 for a provisional application and $15,000 for a non-provisional application. So over the course of 1 year, a company will spend $20,000 on a single technology. It's a lot of money. And if a startup has raised $150,000 in a seed round, or they got $150,000 from an accelerator or an incubator, considering burn rate and the amount of money they're spending up front on getting more engineers, eventually trying to find office space because they'll be kicked out of that incubator 6 months later or 3 months later, that $150,000 is going to go very quickly. And expecting that company at the very end of that year to spend $15,000 to convert that provisional to a full patent application is dangerous. It's a dangerous assumption. It's a dangerous expectation that they'll be able to afford that $15,000 a year later. And so we highly recommend that our clients wait to file provisionals until they can see a funding round coming up within the next year. We'd like there to be some raise, some investment raise between filing a provisional application and filing a non-provisional application. That way we can ensure that that $5,000 on the provisional will be well spent because it won't be abandoned for lack of money. Does that make sense? Okay, so as far as building a patent portfolio goes, those first few applications, whether it's 1 or 5, or in some cases if you're a very expansive platform play, you may have 10 patent applications up front that are really core to your company. They're your core technologies. So like with Pantry, maybe it's hardware, software, and actually a user interface. What does that user interface look like on the screen on this machine? These could be core technologies. Once you reach patent application 10 or 20, whatever it might be, those patent applications, what you're claiming, start to look more focused. They're not as broad and expansive. They're not as core to your company and where you're going as those original patent applications. But that doesn't mean they're any less important to your company. They have a client called Tactus Technology. Pretty neat. Did I tell you all about Tactus on Tuesday? Dynamic tactile touchscreens. I talked to so many people, I'm starting to lose track of what I said. Anyway, Tactus makes this surface that sits on top of a touchscreen. It has little microfluidic channels and a deformable top surface, a tactile layer. There's a little pump inside the phone that displaces fluid through those microfluidic channels to actually expand the surface to create physical buttons, tactile deformations on the surface. So if you want to pull up your messaging app and you want a keyboard that you can actually feel, that pump will turn on and you actually be able to feel all of these buttons. You'll actually get a physical keyboard. It's very cool technology. And so some of those first patent applications were on just the general concept of a pump, some fluid channels, and a deformable region. They were very core. to the company and what they're doing. Later on, we filed more specific patent applications. And then even further after that, Tactus started to realize that their microfluidic technology, when applied to a cell phone or a tablet, could be very useful for other things. And so Tactus, it's unlikely that in the very near future that they will develop technologies regarding these sort of specific, somewhat, not really outlandish, but these other technologies that that's very far down the road. But they saw this need, they've anticipated this need, and it's technologies like that down the road, when Tactus has competitors, when they've proven the market, that these other technologies will help differentiate Tactus from the rest of the crowd. Tactus will be the only company in the world, or at least for the next 20 years, that can use this microfluidic technology to cool a phone. So despite the fact that they seem they're smaller, very specific applications of Tactus's technology, it can be as important, if not more important, down the road to Tactus and its bottom line and the growth of the company. That's sort of what these applications over here look like. So one last thing that I find to be very interesting is that around patent application 20, the 20th app that we've worked on, or sometimes earlier, sometimes later, but usually around 20, we'll sit down with the co-founders of the company, the CTO and the CEO, and we'll ask, who would want to acquire you right now? What company out there is on your horizon as an acquirer? So like for Tactus, maybe it's Apple. Maybe Apple would like to own Tactus in order to really differentiate Apple from Samsung and the Android platform. So if Apple would be interested in acquiring Tactus, how would Apple actually use Tactus's technology? So it's unlikely that what Tactus is doing right now would be directly applicable to Apple. Apple could use that technology in a whole bunch of different ways, things that right now Tactus does not plan on doing. So we have this brainstorm, we ask Tactus, what would Apple do with your technology? And we capture all those different concepts in a handful of patent applications. We build a sort of sub-portfolio of Apple plus Tactus. And that does a couple things. I made the joke that Apple hasn't innovated at all in the last 6 years. When did the first iPhone come out? 2007? It's pretty much the same thing. Got a cooler screen now than we used to, but that's really about it. Despite the fact that we think Apple is incredibly innovative, they really don't have that much imagination. It's the same product. And so by writing and filing these applications, they're almost like a marketing tool for Apple. Apple goes, whoa, we could do that? I want that. Let's give Tactus gobs and gobs of money so that we can buy them and implement their technology right now in our phones. Because we need that next big thing, and maybe Tactus is it. And then maybe Google says, or not Google, let's say Samsung goes, whoa, I don't want Apple to have that. I want it. And so now all of a sudden it's a bidding war, and Apple and Samsung are going back and forth, bidding up Tactus higher and higher and higher and higher. And so maybe that $50 million that Apple originally wanted to pay Tactus turns into $100 million. And so these applications, they have cost $20,000 to $50,000 to prosecute and turn into issued patents. And maybe they're not worth just $1 million or $1.5 million a piece. Maybe they're worth 5 times that, because we anticipated that there'd be this bidding war between some large acquiring companies by asking ourselves and filing applications on how those specific and much larger companies could use Tactus's technology. So that's about all that I have for today.